Early music was always extremely important to Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears. They were great devotees of early music. And in fact, as far as Britten was concerned, there are two figures in the history of early music who were very strong influences on him as a composer. One was Henry Purcell, and the other was the great Elizabethan composer John Dowland. And John Dowland was featured in the very first Aldeburgh Festival in 1948. Dowland, of course, was well known in his time for being something of a celebrity, a great lutenist and a great composer, almost exclusively for the lute, and one of the progenitors of the lute song. In the early 20th century, the lute wasn't quite as well known or well commonly played here in the United Kingdom at least. And when they first performed John Dowland at the 1948 festival, that was on piano with the piano accompaniment. Dowland made another appearance at the Aldeburgh Festival just 2 years later in 1950, and a very special performance it was. Britten composed a piece especially for the great violist William Primrose, and he chose as a source material a work by John Dowland. It basically comes from a couple of works that Dowland composed on the cusp of the 16th and 17th centuries, from the first and second books of airs. Two songs that came out of there were basically the origins of the piece that he wrote. A piece called Lachrymae, and that in itself was the name of a piece that Dowland had composed for a consort in 1604. So Britten probably knew the first and second books of airs because he had them to hand, Peter Pears's versions. But he also chose the viola because Britten himself was in fact a violist. Britten started playing the viola at the age of 10. Of course, his first instrument was the piano, but at the age of 10 he took up the viola and had a wonderful teacher called Audrey Alston. Now, Audrey Alston was a very progressive teacher. She believed that her pupils not only should perform music, but they should experience as much live music as possible. And she suggested that Britten attend the Norfolk and Norwich Festival in 1928. And in 1928, he heard the composer Frank Bridge conduct his own piece, an orchestral suite called The Sea, and in Britten's own words, this knocked him sideways. Now, Britten by this stage had become a composer himself. He'd been writing music for several years, and Frank Bridge took him on as a student over the next 2 years, and Britten more or less became devoted to composition after that. He spent much of his time writing music. In fact, he devoted his school holidays to visiting Frank Bridge and his wife in Sussex and learning as much as possible. So Frank Bridge was responsible for refining a lot of the ideas in Britten's mind as a composer. And he became, in every sense, I suppose, a mentor. And as it happened, Frank Bridge was also a viola player. And there's a very touching story related to the viola that Frank Bridge owned. It was a lovely 19th century instrument. When, in 1939, Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears left to embark on what was going to be a 3-year stay in the United States, Frank Bridge actually gave Britten his own viola. And he left a note with it, basically saying that he hoped that the viola would accompany Britten on his adventures, hoped that he would just carry on progressing. He said, bon voyage et bon retour, with much love from him and his wife Ethel. And quite poignantly, that was actually the last time that he would see Britten. Frank Bridge died in 1941. Britten and Pears returned in 1942. So this piece, Lachrymae, that he wrote, as I say, the basis of it were two songs that John Dowland composed in the first and second book of airs. And it's a beautifully crafted piece in that it really doesn't give us the full song right until the very end. What we hear is the snippets of the song. And these are played more or less as reflections. In fact, the subtitle of the piece is Reflections on a Song by John Dowland. And we hear snippets of the song all the way through in a very interesting set of variations by Britten. And right at the very end, coming through, Britten very graciously, very generously gives the final word to John Dowland himself. We hear the full song coming through. It's quite a heart-wrenching moment, quite an innovative moment, and quite a beautiful moment as well. Lachrymae has a very interesting afterlife as well. Britten decided to revise the piece and arrange it. It was written, of course, originally for piano and viola, but Britten, in his later years, decided to revise the piece and arrange it for viola and string orchestra. And he had in mind another great player, his great friend Cecil Aronowitz. If we look at the composition draft that Britten wrote in 1950, we can see a very assured hand. Very typically with Britten, he had often, before he even put pencil to paper, a very good idea of what the music would sound like, what the finished piece would be. So it more or less came more or less out of his head and straight onto the page. There were, of course, revisions. He was only human after all. But more or less what you got on the page is pretty much the finished work. In 1976, in early 1976, when he decided to revise the piece, we can see Britten obviously struggling with very bad health. In fact, 1976, of course, was the year he passed away. But he was still composing. And if you compare the two manuscripts, you can see quite a contrast. You can see the very shorthand of 1950, and Britten almost struggling to write, very spidery handwriting. And he wrote actually the draft for both viola and for string orchestra straight off. The revised version of Lachrymae for viola and string orchestra with the soloist Cecil Aronowitz took place at the Aldeburgh Festival in 1977, and in some ways that was kind of a homage to Britten, who had passed away the previous December. So I'm sure that performance was a very emotional, very moving performance for all concerned.